In my decades within the halls of Parliament, I have witnessed the profound difference between reform born of prudence and revolution born of passion. Today, as I observe the American Republic grappling with increasingly radical ideologies that echo the dangerous abstractions I once warned against in revolutionary France, I am compelled to speak once more. The United States, which emerged from what I defended as a prudent revolution, one that preserved ancient liberties rather than destroying them, now faces the seductive appeal of revolutionary thinking that promises transformation but delivers destruction. The very principles that made America exceptional are under assault by those who mistake novelty for progress and theory for wisdom. This is not merely a political crisis, but a crisis of civilizational wisdom. The question before America is whether it will remember the lessons of history or repeat the catastrophic errors that have consumed other nations. Can a people preserve their freedoms by abandoning the traditions that secured them? The answer lies not in abstract speculation, but in the accumulated experience of human affairs, experience that speaks with unmistakable clarity about the price of revolutionary folly. Chapter 1: The Seduction of Abstract Revolution. Revolutionary thinking possesses a peculiar magnetism that appeals to the human desire for simple solutions to complex problems. In my years observing the French catastrophe, I learned that revolutionary ideology operates by first convincing men that their present circumstances are utterly intolerable, then promising that complete transformation will yield perfect results. This is the same pattern I now observe spreading through American institutions and discourse. The revolutionary mind begins with a fundamental error. It assumes that human nature and society can be reconstructed according to abstract principles, divorced from historical experience. When the French revolutionaries proclaimed their rights of man, they believed they were discovering eternal truths that could be applied universally, regardless of circumstances, tradition, or practical consequences. They rejected the accumulated wisdom of centuries, dismissing custom as mere prejudice and tradition as superstition. This same spirit now animates those in America who seek to reimagine fundamental institutions, from law enforcement to education, from constitutional interpretation to economic relations. What makes revolutionary thinking so dangerous is its totalizing nature. It cannot accept gradual improvement or partial reform because it views the existing order as fundamentally corrupt. Every institution must be transformed, every tradition questioned, every authority challenged. This creates what I call the revolutionary cascade. Once the principle of total transformation is accepted, there can be no logical stopping point. If marriage, family, property, and law are all social constructs that can be reimagined, then nothing remains stable enough to serve as a foundation for society. The American founders understood this danger intimately. Their revolution was conservative in the truest sense. It sought to preserve ancient English liberties against innovation, not to create a new form of human society. They appealed to precedent, not abstract theory. They sought to restore traditional rights, not invent new ones. This is why their revolution succeeded while the French Revolution devoured its own children. Today's revolutionary thinking in America has abandoned this wisdom. It treats the Constitution not as the culmination of centuries of constitutional development, but as an obstacle to be overcome. It views American history not as a story of imperfect but genuine progress toward justice, but as an unbroken narrative of oppression requiring complete dismantling. This approach ensures that every reform becomes an attack on the foundations of order itself. The tragedy is that legitimate grievances exist. They always do in human society. But revolutionary thinking prevents the kind of patient, prudent reform that could address these problems while preserving what is valuable. Instead, it demands that we choose between perfect justice and total corruption, between complete transformation and absolute stagnation. This false choice destroys the middle ground where real progress occurs. Chapter 2: The French Revolution's Echo in American Politics. The parallels between the intellectual climate that produced the French Revolution and the revolutionary fervor now gripping segments of American society are both striking and alarming. In both cases, we observe the same dangerous combination: abstract philosophy divorced from experience, moral absolutism that brooks no compromise, and the conviction that existing institutions are so corrupt they must be entirely swept away. The French revolutionaries began with seemingly reasonable demands for reform. Who could object to eliminating obvious abuses, reducing arbitrary taxation, or ensuring equal treatment before the law? But they could not stop there. Having adopted the principle that reason alone, unguided by tradition or precedent, should determine social arrangements, they were logically compelled to question everything. If monarchy was unreasonable, why not republic? If Christianity was superstitious, why not reason worship? If private property created inequality, why not communal ownership? Each step seemed to follow naturally from the last. I observe this same logical progression in contemporary American radicalism. What begins as reasonable concern about police misconduct becomes a demand to defund or abolish law enforcement entirely. Legitimate worry about educational inequality transforms into wholesale rejection of merit-based evaluation. Proper attention to historical injustices evolves into condemnation of the entire American project as irredeemably racist. The pattern is identical. Once you accept that institutions can be judged purely by abstract standards of perfect justice, rather than by their actual function in preserving order and liberty, there is no limit to how far destruction can proceed. The French experience teaches us that revolutionary movements inevitably consume their own supporters. The moderate Girondins who helped launch the revolution were executed by the more radical Jacobins, who were in turn destroyed by Robespierre, who was himself eventually guillotined. This occurs because revolutionary logic demands ever greater purity. If the old order was evil, then anyone who shows insufficient enthusiasm for its complete destruction becomes suspect. If traditional institutions are racist, then anyone who defends any aspect of them becomes a racist. The revolution must always find new enemies to justify its continued existence. What made the French Revolution particularly destructive was its attempt to reconstruct society according to philosophical abstractions rather than human nature and historical experience. They tried to create a rational calendar, rational religion, rational family structures, and rational economic systems. All failed catastrophically because they ignored the deep human needs that traditional institutions, however imperfect, actually served. American revolutionaries today make similar errors. They assume that complex social institutions like police, schools, and courts can be replaced by alternatives designed according to theoretical principles of perfect justice. They ignore the hard-won knowledge embedded in existing practices, dismissing it as the product of bias rather than experience. Like their French predecessors, they believe human nature itself can be transformed through proper social engineering. Chapter 3: The Nature of True versus False Representation. One of the most insidious effects of revolutionary thinking is its corruption of the very concept of representation. In my parliamentary experience, I learned that true representation requires much more than simply reflecting the immediate wishes of constituents. A representative serves not merely as a delegate transmitting popular will, but as a trustee exercising judgment for the long-term good of both his constituents and the nation as a whole. This understanding of representation as trusteeship rather than delegation creates what I call virtual representation, the principle that a wise representative can serve the true interests of people even when they disagree with his immediate decisions. Virtual representation recognizes that the people's genuine interests may differ from their expressed desires, especially when those desires are inflamed by passion or misled by demagogy. Revolutionary thinking rejects this sophisticated understanding of representation in favor of a crude majoritarianism that treats any resistance to popular will as illegitimate. This creates a dangerous dynamic where representatives become mere weather vanes, shifting with every gust of public opinion rather than providing the steady leadership that democratic institutions require. We see this corruption of representation throughout American politics today. Politicians compete to demonstrate their responsiveness to the latest polling data rather than their fidelity to constitutional principles or long-term national interest. They mistake pandering for representation and confuse leadership with submission to mob sentiment. This transforms democratic institutions into instruments of passionate democracy rather than deliberative republic. The founders designed American institutions specifically to prevent this degradation. The Electoral College, the Senate, lifetime tenure for federal judges, and the complex amendment process all reflect their understanding that democracy requires filtering mechanisms that slow down popular passion and create space for prudent deliberation. Revolutionary thinking views all such mechanisms as obstacles to democracy rather than essential components of it. Consider how different this is from the patient work of constitutional representation. When I defended the American colonists against British taxation, I was not simply reflecting popular opinion in Britain. Indeed, I was often arguing against it. Instead, I was representing the true interests of the British Empire, which required maintaining constitutional principles even when politically costly. I understood that temporary popularity mattered less than preserving the constitutional foundations that made both British liberty and imperial unity possible. True representation requires the courage to disappoint constituents when their immediate desires conflict with their deeper interests or with justice itself. It means sometimes voting against popular measures that would undermine constitutional order, sometimes supporting unpopular policies that serve the national good, and always maintaining fidelity to principles even when politically inconvenient. This creates a profound challenge for representatives in our current environment. How do we maintain democratic accountability while resisting the revolutionary demand for absolute responsiveness to popular passion? The answer lies in patient education, helping citizens understand why constitutional constraints serve their own long-term interests, even when they frustrate immediate desires. Chapter 4: Political Economy and the Revolutionary Assault on Property. Revolutionary thinking reveals its most dangerous character in its approach to political economy and property rights. Having observed both the British Empire's economic vitality and the French Revolution's economic chaos, I can speak with confidence about the catastrophic consequences of applying abstract theories of justice to complex economic relationships. Property rights form the foundation of all civilized society, not because they are theoretically perfect, but because they have proven, through centuries of experience, to be the most reliable mechanism for encouraging human productivity, creativity, and social cooperation. When revolutionary theorists attack property as inherently unjust, whether through outright socialism or through more subtle forms of redistribution, they are attacking the very basis of prosperity and freedom. The French revolutionaries made exactly this error. Convinced that property inequality was the root of social problems, they experimented with various schemes for redistributing wealth according to abstract principles of justice. These experiments invariably failed because they ignored the practical knowledge embedded in market relationships and the moral incentives that property ownership provides. Contemporary American revolutionaries make similar mistakes when they treat economic inequality as evidence of systemic injustice requiring systematic correction through government intervention. They assume that different outcomes necessarily indicate unfair processes, ignoring the complex factors, including individual choices, cultural differences, and natural variation in talents and circumstances, that influence economic results. This revolutionary approach to economics is particularly dangerous because it undermines the trust and predictability that economic cooperation requires. When property rights become subject to political redistribution according to changing theories of justice, individuals lose the security necessary for long-term planning and investment. Capital flees, innovation slows, and the prosperity that makes generosity possible gradually disappears. Yet I do not defend property rights as absolute or unlimited. Property ownership carries moral obligations to the broader community. Wealth brings responsibility for promoting the general welfare, not through government compulsion, but through the voluntary exercise of social duty. The great landed proprietors of England understood this responsibility and generally fulfilled it through charitable works, public service, and careful stewardship of their estates. The genius of the American system lies in its ability to harness individual economic incentives for social benefit while maintaining space for moral obligation and community responsibility. This requires neither the socialist destruction of property rights nor the libertarian denial of social obligation. Instead, it demands what I call moral economy, an economic system that respects both individual rights and community welfare. Revolutionary economics fails because it tries to achieve just outcomes through unjust means, violating property rights in order to redistribute wealth according to abstract theories rather than earned merit. This approach inevitably produces neither justice nor prosperity, but only the kind of economic chaos and social resentment that destroys the foundations of civil society. The alternative is patient reform that addresses legitimate economic grievances while preserving the institutional foundations of prosperity. This means improving education and opportunity rather than redistributing outcomes, encouraging charitable responsibility rather than mandating equality, and trusting in the gradual improvement that free societies naturally produce when their institutions are properly maintained. Chapter 5: Religion, Morality, and the Secular Revolution. Perhaps nowhere is the destructive character of revolutionary thinking more evident than in its assault on religious tradition and moral authority. In my observations of both successful and failed societies, I have consistently found that religion serves as the essential foundation of public morality and social order. Not because religious doctrines are necessarily true in every particular, but because religious institutions provide the moral framework that makes civilized life possible. The French revolutionaries understood this connection between religion and social order, which is precisely why they sought to destroy traditional Christianity and replace it with their cult of reason. They recognized that you cannot transform society completely while leaving unchanged the moral and spiritual foundations that shaped the old order. Their secular revolution was not an accident or side effect, it was a logical necessity of their revolutionary project. Contemporary American revolutionaries follow the same logic. They understand that traditional religious values, emphasis on personal responsibility, respect for authority, commitment to family, and acceptance of moral absolutes, are incompatible with their vision of total social transformation. Therefore, religious influence must be systematically eliminated from public life and ultimately from private life as well. This secular revolution proceeds through several stages. First, religion is relegated to the purely private sphere, declared irrelevant to public policy and social arrangements. Then, traditional religious teachings are redefined as forms of bigotry or hate speech that threaten public safety. Finally, religious institutions themselves are required to conform to secular revolutionary principles or lose their social legitimacy and legal protections. The tragedy is that this process destroys not only religious faith but the moral consensus that makes democratic self-government possible. When citizens no longer share basic moral assumptions about right and wrong, truth and falsehood, justice and injustice, democratic deliberation becomes impossible. Politics devolves into pure power struggle between incompatible worldviews. I do not argue for religious establishment in the narrow sense. America's founders were wise to prohibit official state churches. But I do insist that some form of religious influence is essential for maintaining the moral sentiments that free government requires. Citizens must believe that moral truths exist, that individual actions have moral consequences, and that social institutions should reflect moral principles rather than mere power relationships. The established Church of England, despite its imperfections, provided this moral foundation for British society. It taught respect for lawful authority, concern for the poor, and the importance of moral duty, lessons that made constitutional government possible. When revolutionary ideology undermines these teachings, it undermines the moral prerequisites of freedom itself. Consider how different religious and secular approaches to social problems prove to be. Religious charity emphasizes personal relationship, moral transformation, and community responsibility. Secular welfare programs emphasize bureaucratic efficiency, legal entitlement, and government responsibility. The first approach strengthens social bonds and moral character, the second weakens both. This does not mean that government has no role in addressing social problems, but it does mean that government action cannot substitute for the moral formation that religious institutions provide. A society that tries to maintain justice and prosperity while abandoning religious influence inevitably finds itself replacing moral obligation with legal compulsion, a trade that benefits neither freedom nor virtue. Chapter 6: Federalism Under Assault, the Centralizing Revolution. The revolutionary assault on American institutions reveals itself with particular clarity in the systematic attack on federalism and local governance. Revolutionary thinking, by its very nature, cannot tolerate the diversity and complexity that federal systems preserve. It demands uniformity, efficiency, and central control, characteristics that make gradual reform impossible and revolutionary transformation inevitable. The genius of the American federal system lies in its recognition that different communities may legitimately organize themselves in different ways while remaining part of a larger constitutional union. This allows for what I call organic diversity, the kind of variation that emerges naturally from different circumstances, traditions, and preferences rather than being imposed by central authority. But revolutionary ideology cannot accept such diversity because it interprets all differences as evidence of injustice. If one state has different educational policies than another, revolutionaries assume the difference must reflect bias rather than legitimate variation in local priorities. If communities organize themselves differently, revolutionaries see oppression rather than a natural expression of different values and circumstances. This leads inevitably to demands for federal intervention to impose uniform standards according to revolutionary principles. What begins as concern about obvious injustices, slavery being the classic example, evolves into comprehensive federal control over every aspect of local governance. Education, law enforcement, economic regulation, environmental policy, and even family relations all become subjects for federal standardization. The irony is that this centralizing tendency destroys the very mechanism that allowed America to address legitimate injustices gradually and peacefully. The federal system provided space for different states to experiment with different approaches, allowing successful innovations to spread naturally while unsuccessful experiments remained localized. This is how America gradually eliminated slavery in the North, expanded voting rights, and improved economic opportunity, through patient example rather than revolutionary imposition. My experience with imperial governance taught me that successful political unions must balance central authority with local autonomy. The British Empire succeeded when it allowed colonial societies to develop their own institutions while maintaining allegiance to common constitutional principles. It failed when it tried to impose uniform policies without regard for local circumstances and traditions. The American federal system embodied this wisdom by creating a national government strong enough to preserve union and protect fundamental rights, but limited enough to allow local communities substantial self-governance. This balance made possible both the preservation of diverse traditions and the gradual convergence toward greater justice and prosperity. Revolutionary centralization destroys this balance by treating all local variation as suspect and all federal intervention as presumptively just. This creates a vicious cycle. As federal control increases, local institutions atrophy, which creates new problems that seem to require additional federal intervention. Eventually, the capacity for local self-governance disappears entirely, leaving citizens dependent on distant bureaucracies that understand neither their particular needs nor their particular wisdom. The alternative to revolutionary centralization is what I call prudent federalism, a system that maintains strong central authority over truly national concerns while preserving genuine local autonomy over community affairs. This requires careful attention to the proper sphere of each level of government and resistance to the revolutionary temptation to nationalize every political question. Such federalism serves both liberty and effectiveness by keeping government close to the people it serves while maintaining the coordination necessary for national prosperity and security. Chapter 7: Restoring Constitutional Wisdom in Revolutionary Times. The question that now confronts America is whether constitutional wisdom can be restored in the face of revolutionary fervor, or whether the Republic will follow the path of France toward chaos and eventual tyranny. The answer depends largely on whether Americans can rediscover the patient virtues that made their original revolution successful: prudence rather than passion, precedent rather than theory, gradual reform rather than total transformation. Constitutional wisdom begins with proper understanding of human nature and political possibility. Humans are neither angels who can be trusted with unlimited power nor devils who must be controlled through force. They are moral agents capable of both good and evil, who require institutions that channel their self-interest toward public benefit while constraining their capacity for injustice. The American Constitution embodied this realistic anthropology through its complex system of checks and balances, separation of powers, and federalism. Revolutionary thinking rejects this realistic view of human nature in favor of either utopian optimism or dystopian pessimism. Revolutionary optimists believe that proper social arrangements can eliminate human selfishness and create perfect justice. Revolutionary pessimists believe that existing institutions are so corrupt that only total destruction can address systemic oppression. Both views lead to the same practical conclusion: existing constitutional constraints must be eliminated to achieve social transformation. The restoration of constitutional wisdom requires patience with imperfection and commitment to gradual improvement rather than perfect solutions. This does not mean accepting injustice or ignoring legitimate grievances. It means addressing problems through constitutional means rather than revolutionary ones, using established procedures for reform rather than extra-legal pressure for transformation. Consider how different constitutional and revolutionary approaches to current American challenges would be. Constitutional reform of policing would focus on better training, clearer accountability mechanisms, and improved community relations, changes that could be implemented through normal political processes while preserving law and order. Revolutionary transformation demands abolishing or defunding police entirely, regardless of practical consequences or public safety needs. Similarly, constitutional approaches to educational improvement would emphasize school choice, teacher accountability, and curriculum reform, changes that work within existing institutional frameworks while addressing real problems. Revolutionary approaches demand complete reconstruction of educational institutions according to ideological principles, regardless of educational effectiveness or parental preferences. The key difference lies in the relationship between means and ends. Constitutional wisdom insists that just ends cannot be achieved through unjust means, that procedures matter as much as outcomes, that respect for rights must be maintained even when pursuing greater equality, and that institutional preservation matters more than temporary political advantage. This creates what appears to be a disadvantage for constitutional conservatives in political competition with revolutionaries. Revolutionary movements can promise immediate, comprehensive solutions to complex problems, while constitutional approaches require patience, compromise, and incremental progress. But this apparent disadvantage is actually a strength, because constitutional methods produce lasting change while revolutionary methods produce only temporary chaos followed by reaction. The ultimate test of American character will be whether citizens choose the difficult path of constitutional reform over the superficially attractive path of revolutionary transformation. This choice will determine not only America's political future but its character as a civilized nation capable of preserving liberty through law rather than losing both liberty and order through revolutionary excess. Conclusion. As I reflect upon the lessons of history and the challenges facing America today, I am struck by both the gravity of the current crisis and the genuine hope that constitutional wisdom provides. The revolutionary fervor now gripping significant portions of American society represents a profound test of whether a free people can maintain their liberties through patient reform or whether they will sacrifice both freedom and order on the altar of ideological purity. The choice before America is fundamentally the same choice that faced every generation, whether to trust in the accumulated wisdom of constitutional government or to gamble everything on the abstract promises of revolutionary transformation. History speaks with unmistakable clarity about the results of this choice. Constitutional societies that reform gradually while preserving their foundational principles achieve both greater justice and greater prosperity than revolutionary societies that sacrifice everything for theoretical perfection. But this choice cannot be made by institutions alone. It must be made by citizens who understand the difference between liberty and license, between reform and revolution, between prudent change and destructive innovation. It requires what I call constitutional character, the civic virtues that enable free government to function effectively. The preservation of American constitutional order depends ultimately not on political leaders or institutional mechanisms, but on whether ordinary citizens choose to cultivate the patience, prudence, and practical wisdom that democratic self-government requires. This is both a demanding and hopeful truth, demanding because it places the burden of preservation on each individual citizen, hopeful because it means that constitutional government can be preserved by those who understand its value and are willing to defend it through faithful citizenship rather than revolutionary excitement.